Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into the International Criminal Court and the modern-day Dreyfus trial. Let's get started. This week has been quite the week for news. And the headlines most of you have probably heard by now is that Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Galant, the Israeli Prime Minister and former Minister of Defense, have been charged with war crimes in the International Criminal Court. The charges for the two men are as follows. According to the United Nations, after doing some reports, they have released the figures of somewhere between 280,000 to 500,000 civilians killed. Actually, hold on a minute. Sorry, I got my notes wrong there. That was Bashar al-Assad in Syria, but he wasn't charged with war crimes. My mistake. The International Criminal Court has released figures somewhere between 800,000 and 2 million people being held against their will in jails and prison camps, which goes completely against human rights and everything that United Nations stand for. Actually, hold on a second. Sorry, my mistake. That's actually the Uyghur Muslims in China, but Chinese President Xi Jinping was definitely not charged with war crimes, so that can't be right. Whew, this is kind of embarrassing. This is probably it. The UN is reporting that 10,000 men, women, children, and newborns were killed in over 300 villages that were burnt to the ground, and 700,000 were forced to flee. The High Commissioner of Human Rights at the UN has called this brutal campaign a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Wait a minute, that's not right. 40,000, they say. Oh, sorry, that is actually the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. I know I may not be the greatest actor, and you probably saw through that little gimmick that I did, but it really is to prove a point. Currently, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has not brought charges on any of those people, and there are so many more I could list around the world. People who are, according to the United Nations, committing ethnic cleansing and genocide, but no charges. Meanwhile, apparently the ICC thinks that it can get enough evidence on the Israeli Prime Minister and Minister of Defense to bring war crimes trials, and initiated arrest warrants. Their crimes, allegedly, are much less than what I just read to you. Their crimes are supposedly using starvation in Gaza, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also purposefully targeting civilians. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Not to compare tragedies here, but compared to killing 500,000 people, including using chemical weapons, which are illegal, no word from the International Criminal Court, no warrants, no arrests. No comment from the ICC against China, who is currently imprisoning Muslim people in their own communities for, quote, re-education. Clearly, that is definitely not as important as Gaza. I know I'm probably speaking to the choir here, and that most of you already know this stuff and agree and realize the hypocrisy and the stupidity of all of this. But on this episode, I want to talk a little bit about how this case has turned into a replay of something that's gone on a very long time ago, the Dreyfus trial. But let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about the supposed war crimes that Israel is committing now. On its face, these charges are pretty much ridiculous. If we look at this concept of starvation as a method of war, something that apparently Netanyahu is doing, it is very easily debunked, considering the fact, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, that not another country in the entire world is responsible to feed and clothe and house and medicate people that have attacked them. It's never been done. What this law was intending to do is to stop armies from blockading an entire area of civilians and refusing to allow food in, thus starving them into submission. According to COGAT, the organization that Israel tasks on facilitating logistics and all of that stuff to get the aid into Gaza, says that to this day, over 1 million tons of aid has gone in. This includes 60,000 trucks and 9,900 pallets of aid. Does this really sound like Israel is intentionally starving an area? Over 1 million tons of aid entering Gaza? This is the exact opposite of what the law says you would have to do in order to be charged with this war crime. According to the UN law, the prohibition of starvation as a method of warfare does not prohibit a siege warfare-style war, as long as the purpose is to achieve military objectives and not to starve civilians. Therefore, what Israel is doing, sending aid in and getting it into people, and even allowing for certain times of day where people can walk freely in order to go get aid, is exactly the opposite of what they're charging Israel with. The last I heard, there was over 2,000 calories per person going into Gaza per day. And this is supposedly starvation? Doesn't really make sense to me until you realize what's really going on here. And that is what we've been talking about on this podcast for months now. Hamas, in conjunction with UNRWA, which is essentially at this point just an arm of Hamas, has allowed the 1.1 million tons of aid to come in and doesn't do anything with it. There is ample evidence and photos of pallets filled with food and aid sitting at the border. For those of you who aren't aware of the process, what happens is Israel facilitates checking anything that's coming from the outside world. They take it onto trucks. The trucks go in through the border crossings, and they have a drop-off spot because the Israeli trucks are not going to be going into Gaza due to fear of the Israeli drivers being harmed in some way. And they are meant to be picked up and facilitated by UNRWA or even Hamas, who's unfortunately technically their government, to get it to the people. But they don't want it to go to the people. Part of their plan is the starvation. That's how they get all the good photos and videos for social media. That's how they get the pressure on the international stage, by not giving the aid to Gaza. We also have talked on this podcast a lot about how they are taking that aid, putting it in their own warehouses, not only to give to their own fighters, who are well-fed if you've seen the pictures, but to give it to their friends and UNRWA employees to sell on the black market at exorbitant prices. Last I heard, they've made over $1 billion off of the free international aid that you and everybody you know has been paying to send into Gaza. They have made $1 billion selling it to their people. Even the United Nations had to come out in a press conference and very carefully say that their trucks that were supposed to be going to the Gazans were being hijacked and stolen, but they couldn't tell anybody who was stealing them, as if they don't really know. So is it really Israel's fault? Is Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Galant, quote, using starvation as a method of killing people in Gaza? Or are they facilitating more aid now than ever went in before? It's just not getting to the people. And whose fault is that? Is it possible that maybe the International Criminal Court should be charging Hamas leaders and UNRWA, their own organization, for not sending that aid to where it belongs? Maybe the people from the International Criminal Court should actually go and take a look at how much aid is just sitting there and waiting to go in. But we'll get to that a little bit later. The second charge at the International Criminal Court is that supposedly the Israelis are just indiscriminately killing civilians, which we all know to be complete BS, but let's just take a look at it. We've talked on this podcast before the methods that Israel uses before striking a building, the flyers that are dropped in advance to warn people to leave an area, the text messages that are sent, the phone calls that are made, and then the door knocker bombs, which typically are sent before a strike to warn people you need to leave now because this building will be destroyed. For an army that is, quote, intentionally killing civilians, this seems like a really stupid idea. Why tell people to leave when you want to kill them? And just out of curiosity, how many other countries in the entire world, UN members or not, do this before striking in a war? Right now, currently, Turkish President Erdogan is carpet bombing Kurdish people in Syria. He has cut off water to 1 million people while bombing them. And we have not heard one claim of why is he not giving text messages before he kills the Kurds? Why is he not phoning them to tell them to get out of the way? None of that's happening. And nobody is even talking about it. And even if we pretend like all of the stuff that Israel is doing is not enough to warn civilians to get out of the way, the fact that the numbers don't lie, by all estimates, if we include Hamas numbers, which are totally fake, the combatant to civilian ratio in Gaza right now is anywhere from 1 casualty of a bad guy to 1 or 1.5 casualties of innocent civilians, which is unheard of in modern warfare. According to the United Nations itself, in modern warfare, a normal casualty ratio of combatant to civilian is 1 to 9. That's what most armies, including the United States, does. And they're not on trial for war crimes. So this charge that Israel is intentionally killing innocent civilians literally doesn't exist in the numbers of how many people are dead. And that's using the numbers from Hamas, who are already lying. At the start of this conflict, I remember specifically the UN and the world in general told Israel there is no way that you can move populations to get them out of harm's way. Don't even start a war. You can't move them, so leave them there and don't bomb Hamas, even if they use them as human shields. And meanwhile, Israel did in fact move people multiple times. It's not perfect, but the fact is that saved many lives, sending people to displaced persons camps where there's food and medication and doctors. And this, to the ICC, is proof that they are purposefully killing people? Let's leave aside the fact that they've just done one of the largest polio vaccine campaigns ever to be done in the world in such a short amount of time during a war. But that's definitely a genocide when you give people medication to not be sick. Again, maybe if the UN ICC actually went to Gaza, they may have seen a few of these things. But why didn't they go to Gaza? Some may suggest, well, it's a war, it's very dangerous, the UN can't go. But that's not really true. When the United Nations, ICJ, and ICC threatened this idea of a genocide or of an ethnic cleansing or of war crimes, Israel told them they can come, have the prosecutors show up, we'll take them into Gaza, they can speak to whoever they want to speak to, they could take a look at what's going on, they could have free reign to look through and see if there's any crimes being committed here, because Israel knows there aren't any crimes being committed there. According to the United States, the prosecutor of the ICC that is laying these charges was supposed to show up to Gaza with the US and 4 other countries in order to investigate. But right before he was supposed to show up to Gaza, he didn't show up and he laid the charges against Netanyahu. He actively did not go and investigate. He preferred to charge with zero evidence. Maybe he thought that his TikTok feed would be more than enough evidence for an international criminal court trial, since he didn't feel like going to Gaza was important. And for context, in Ukraine, when the war started, the UN sent prosecutors to the areas that were affected and investigated and did find evidence of war crimes against Vladimir Putin. And they eventually charged him in the International Criminal Court. That's how things are supposed to work. Evidence, then a case. Why is it different in this situation? Why is it that the prosecutor chose to not bother to investigate before actually charging the people with the crimes? And there are a few reasons for this. Some we've talked about before. The first and most important reason that I've talked about endlessly on this podcast is the fact that this is all an attempt to pressure Israel into giving up their war against Iran and its proxies. Hamas is on its way out. Hezbollah is on its way out. Iran itself has been proven to be completely useless and on its way out. So they need this to stop immediately so they can rebuild, they can try and recover whatever dignity and chances they have of surviving. And they've tried everything. They've tried PR. They've tried getting the Western world involved and have the US president demand a ceasefire. They've tried to have South Africa bring a case at the International Court of Justice, which failed. And then they had this prosecutor threaten, if you don't stop Netanyahu, I'm going to charge you with war crimes. And they finally followed through because Israel is not stopping. So they needed to up the ante, to put the pressure on Israel to finally give up and allow Hamas to survive, to allow Hezbollah to rebuild, and just go back to being attacked on a daily basis. The other reason is very clear. It gives the world who hates Israel a reason to hate Israel. Everyone looks to the UN as if it's some amazing place filled with noble people, and yet it's not. It is literally being used as a weapon against one state. We saw it after the ICJ case, where when they officially laid the claim of genocide against Israel, how the pro-Pali media was talking nonstop about how it's going to prove that there's a genocide. And then it didn't. But once it's out there, it gives validation to all of those hate-filled people who just want to make sure that Israel is seen as a villain in the world. And this is where the Dreyfus trial comes in. I've talked about the Dreyfus trial before on one of our earlier episodes. If you want to go back and listen, it's episode 27, Zionism equals Racism Against the Jews. But the Dreyfus trial, which took place in 1894, saw a high-up French military man who happened to be Jewish put on trial for suspicion of treason because he was Jewish. This idea of a court case that's happening, holding a Jew responsible for something they did not do, as a public shaming, as a public flogging, as proving the Jews are not loyal and the Jews are terrible. This rampant anti-Semitism that happened outside the court actually led to Theodor Herzl's book that proposed the idea of a Jewish state as a place where Jews can go and be free from being put on trial for treason for no reason, or hearing death to the Jews in the streets of their cities. And it's so ironic that today, the same thing is happening. 130 years later, nothing has changed. Benjamin Netanyahu is essentially Dreyfus. Israel, the state, is now the modern-day Jewish person on trial. The world wants Jewish blood. The world wants to blame the Jews for everything, and they will put you on trial needlessly just to prove how terrible the Jews are. And just like Dreyfus, Netanyahu is not guilty of these charges, but they want to put him up on that pedestal, and they want the locals in the world to throw tomatoes and yell at him and say to him, death to Jews, death to Israel. It is honestly somewhat depressing to see that 130 years has passed by and not much has changed. The Jew is being put on trial again for something they didn't actually commit, and the world is cheering for his blood. In the end, we always say that history repeats itself, and we're seeing it in real time. Not only are we seeing the repetition of the Dreyfus issues, we are seeing the anti-Semitism of the 1930s all around the world. Clearly, we have not learned from the past, and so we are absolutely repeating it. In the Dreyfus trial, reports showed that the prosecutors forged information to try and throw the Jew under the bus and try and get the Jew put in jail for treason. Today, we are seeing the exact same thing, and that is the ICC's prosecutor refused to actually get evidence, refused to go to Gaza, and instead just made up facts of his own. And it is absolutely not a mistake that a Pakistani Muslim who is allowed to lie under the idea of taqiyya in Islam, where you are allowed to lie to non-Muslims if it somehow helps Islam in some way. And knowing that they are going to try and take down Bibi Netanyahu on the international stage and try and delegitimize Israel and demonize Israel, he is more than happy to commit these false accusations against a Jew or the Jewish state to get what he wants, which is that Pakistan, Iran, and the entire Arab world wants Israel delegitimized and taken off of the map. This complete sham of a trial, which essentially means nothing, to be honest with you. Vladimir Putin was charged with war crimes not that long ago, and he is still doing what he's doing. Doesn't really cause any issue. But what Iran and this prosecutor and many other people are trying to do through the UN and the International Criminal Court is commit a modern-day Dreyfus trial to get the world to start screaming, kill the Jews. And sadly, this shit is working. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.